Welcome, everybody. If you are just joining us, we're going to give people just 1 or 2 more minutes to join the meeting and get situated, and then we'll get started. Let's see. All right, Molly, well, I'm going to go ahead and just get us kicked off since we're now crossed the threshold of 12 noon. So welcome everybody to today's Lunch and Learn. This is a continuation of our Read by Fourth Lunch and Learn series where we bring outside presenters and experts in the early literacy field generally to present to our partner network about various topics in early literacy. So I'm very excited to be joined today by Molly Schlesinger from the School District of Philadelphia's Office of Research and Accountability. And just to note that we, like other Lunch and Learns, will be recording this session. So you may have received a notification when you joined, but we will be posting this, the recording of this session to our YouTube channel after the event. So you can look for it there if you'd like to share it with colleagues or, watch the session again later if you missed anything. And in just a moment, I will pass the mic over to Molly. But I wanted to also just make a quick reminder about the intended format of our Lunch and Learn. So like with all of our sessions, we hope to foster conversation rather than just sort of a back and forth Q&A. So Molly will be presenting, and then if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We can also, after Molly is finished presenting, we'll have time for questions, for comments, reactions, etc. Let's see. Yeah, and just well, very briefly, would like to go ahead and introduce Molly. Molly is a senior research associate in the office of, as I mentioned, the Office of Research and Evaluation at the School District of Philadelphia. She received her PhD in developmental psychology from the University of California and completed a postdoc fellowship concentrating on creativity and learning out of school at Temple University. Molly will be presenting today about the STAR assessments, specifically literacy performance in grades K through 3. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Molly.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. So as Alex mentioned, today I'll be focusing on the topic of assessing student literacy performance in kindergarten through 3rd grade at the School District of Philadelphia. I work in the Office of Research and Evaluation here at the school district, and I'm also joined by 2 colleagues at the district, Brewer Adam and Joseph Taylor, so they might be popping up to help me answer some questions today. So as I mentioned, so for today's agenda, what I'll be talking about today is how the district's within-year tests measure early literacy skills, the district early literacy performance in 21-22 or last year, and where to find district early literacy data. So as I mentioned, I work in the Office of Research and Evaluation. You can learn more about our office by visiting philasd.org/research. In our office, we support the School District of Philadelphia by collecting, summarizing, analyzing information, and presenting the results in clear and actionable ways. For example, one of our major data collection efforts is the district-wide survey, which I've linked here. We also serve as a hub to coordinate projects with and by external researchers. In some cases, this means that we review proposals to conduct research in our schools through our research review committee, which some of you might be familiar with. And in other cases, it might mean that we work with researchers to collaborate on research projects to expand the scope and depth of information that we can develop, like through the Philadelphia Education Research Consortium, or PERC. A lot of the work that we do is for internal audiences to support the day-to-day work of our district colleagues. However, as much as possible, we try to make our work publicly available as well. One way we do this is by publishing reports and briefs and even slide decks on our website, which is linked below, or you can always just visit philasd.org/research, and our reports and briefs pop up right at the top of that page. ORE is part of the Research Evaluation and Accountability Office, or ERA as we call it. ERA is comprised of 5 offices: ORE, as I've mentioned, the District Performance Office, Planning and Evidence-Based Supports Office, the Office of Assessments, and the Office of Data Governance. Through our collective efforts, ERA conducts a variety of projects related to research, evaluation, surveys, data analysis, data quality, school supports, assessments, and accountability. You can find a lot more about ERA by visiting our website at the top of the page here. ERA also maintains the School Profiles website, which has searchable and deep dives related to district and charter schools. And ERA also manages the district's open data website, which has dozens of downloadable data sets related to school information, school performance, district employees, and finance. I'll talk more about all of these links and different data sources at the end of this presentation. So the goals for this presentation. Ideally, at the end, attendees will better understand how the districts within your tests, our Renaissance Star tests, measure early literacy skills, K-3 district students' early literacy performance in 21-22 school year, and where to find district early literacy data. So why is early literacy important? I think this group is pretty well aware of why early literacy is important, but I'll give a little bit of background so that when we look at the data, we're coming at it with a similar perspective. So research groups have identified the building blocks of early literacy. The introduction of the Common Core state standards in 2010 highlighted the importance of building students' foundational literacy skills, especially phonics and phonemic awareness. Teaching phonics skills and phonemic awareness are not sufficient on their own. Students must know what a word means, so teachers must also build students' vocabulary and background knowledge to enable students to comprehend what they're reading. Common Core standards require students to frequently engage with rich and complex texts, which both require students to have and supports the development of complex reading skills, vocabulary, and background. Fluency is as much about reading accurately and quickly as being able to understand what we're reading. When students read aloud, they can show their understanding of what they're reading by reacting to punctuation and reading with intonation and expression. During guided reading, students work with a teacher in groups separated by reading level. Students read and analyze text at their instructional level rather than text deemed too challenging or too easy. As students read aloud, they can practice their fluency, and teachers can support phonics skills and vocabulary. Reading comprehension refers to gaining meaning from the given text. A student knows how the combination of letters make up a word, what it sounds like, and what it means. Reading comprehension, of course, plays a vital role in knowledge acquisition. So these are the general building blocks that I want us to be considering as we end up going through the data. But before we get into the data, I want to talk about how we actually measure early literacy skills in the district. So the district uses STAR assessments to measure students' early literacy development. STAR assessments, published by Renaissance Learning, are a suite of computer adaptive tests, what we refer to as CATs, and curriculum-based measures, or CBMs. These assessments measure students' reading and math skills, monitor achievement and growth, and track how well students understand skills aligned to the Common Core standards. STAR results are used to identify students who are meeting grade level and term level benchmarks in literacy and math, as well as those who may need additional support or interventions. As a district, we also use the CATs, our computer adaptive tests, to monitor our student progress towards our district-wide board goals. When and how is STAR administered? STAR assessments are administered 4 times a year to all of our K through 12 students in the district. For the 2022-23 school year, this year, schools will administer the STAR assessments during 4 windows, one of which is optional. Fall, which was administered in September, Winter 1, which will be administered in January, Winter 2, which will be administered in March, is optional, and Spring, which will be administered in May. For the purposes of this talk, when I talk about data from winter, I'm going to be referring to Winter 1 because Winter 2 is optional this year. Both curriculum-based measures are CBMs and the computer adaptive assessments, CATs, are timed assessments. The CVMs all take 60 seconds and are administered by a teacher. For the CATs, students typically require 15 to 25 minutes to complete the CATs. Because the CATs are adaptive tests, it means that the questions will become more or less difficult depending on student responses. For example, if a student answers a question incorrectly, the next question might be easier. Therefore, 2 students taking the same assessment may receive very different sets of questions depending on their responses, and the length of the assessment might differ. There are 2 types of STAR assessments, as I mentioned, that I'm going to be talking about today. The first is the CATs, the computer adaptive tests, and the second is the CBMs, the curriculum-based measures. As I said on the previous slide, our CATs are adaptive tests that adjust the difficulty of items depending on how students performed on the previous items. And just to make things more complicated for you, there's 2 types of CATs I'll be talking about today, but I'll be talking about them together. There's the STAR Early Literacy CATs for students in grades K and 2, or K through 2. The STAR Early Literacy CATs primarily focus on word knowledge and skills and comprehension strategies in constructing meaning. The second CAT I'll be talking about is STAR Reading for students in grades 3 through 12 and primarily focuses on vocabulary and comprehension strategies and constructing meaning for 3rd graders, which is the population I'll be talking about today. Students switch from STAR Early Literacy to STAR Reading either from 2nd to 3rd grade or once they've achieved 852 scale score points. STAR Early Literacy and STAR Reading are on the same scale and have similar questions, and students transition from one to the other, sometimes within the same school year. Therefore, scores on both assessments can be prepared. And today, anytime I say I'm talking about the STAR Reading CATs, I'm going to be talking about the STAR Early Literacy and STAR Reading CATs sort of together. For the CBMs, these are, like I've mentioned before, 1-minute probes that measure skills foundational to either math or reading. And of course, today we're talking about literacy, so I'll be talking about the reading skills. Each of our grade levels who take the CBMs take slightly different CBMs. So our kindergartners take letter naming, letter sounds, phoneme segmentation, and receptive nonsense words, CBMs. Our 1st graders take letter sounds, phoneme segmentation, expressive nonsense words, and passage oral reading CBMs. Our 2nd graders take expressive nonsense words and passage oral reading CBMs, and our 3rd through 5th graders take passage oral reading CBMs. We use information from both types of assessments, the CATs and the CBMs, to guide decision-making in the classroom and district-wide. STAR also provides a variety of metrics for us to use to understand our students' progress. The first metric they provide, the primary metric, is the scaled score. A student's scaled score is calculated based on the difficulty of the questions that they answered and the number of correct responses they provided. Because the same range of questions is used for all students across all grade levels, scale scores can be used to compare student performance across grade levels. So for example, we can compare a student in 3rd grade to a student in 4th grade based on their scale score for STAR. That's something we can't do with a test like the PSSAs because the PSSAs have different tests for 3rd graders and 4th graders. Percentile rank is another metric that STAR provides. A student's percentile rank is a norm reference performance measure that compares a student's scale score to their grade level peers nationwide. A percentile rank is useful for understanding a student's current mastery of reading or math skills compared to other students in the same grade level nationally. A percentile rank is on a 1 to 99 point scale. It's much easier to interpret Then scale scores, which range from about 600 points to I think 1400. So it's a bit complicated to try to interpret those. Performance group is another metric that STAR provides. A student's performance group is based on their percentile rank. Students are categorized into one of 4 performance groups, which indicate the level of intervention students need in order to reach their grade level benchmarks. Here are the 4 performance groups. The first one is at or above benchmark. This is for students who've scored in the 40th percentile or above. This refers to students who are performing on grade level or above grade level on STAR. On watch is the next performance group. This is for students who've performed in the 25th to 39th percentile. These are students who are not quite on grade level, but they're pretty close. The next group is strategic intervention. These are students who have scored in the 10th through the 24th percentile, and these are students who really need strategic targeted intervention in order to make progress and perform on grade level. The final group is intensive intervention, students who have scored in the 10th percentile or below the 10th percentile. These are students who really need intensive and a lot of intervention in order to make progress and eventually perform on grade level. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm only going to be presenting data on performance group because it's simpler. And I'm primarily going to be talking about the percentage of our students scoring in each of these 4 performance groups. Additionally, although I'll be presenting data on all 4 of these performance groups, I'm only going to be talking about the percentage of students scoring at or above benchmark or the percentage of students scoring at grade level. So this sort of dark blue at or above benchmark group. So how did students do on our STAR Early Literacy and STAR Reading CATs last year? Here are the skills that our STAR Early Literacy and STAR Reading tests capture for our K-3 students. I'm going to give examples of each of these, but they primarily focus on word knowledge and skills, vocabulary, comprehension strategies and constructing meaning, analyzing literacy texts, numbers and operations, and understanding author's craft. So I'll go and give examples of what these different questions look like. For word knowledge and skills, a kindergartner might get a question like, how many words are in the sentence, ducks swim? So they have to use their knowledge of the different words in order to get the correct answer. For comprehension strategies and constructing meaning, a first grader might get a question that is, listen carefully. Rosa and Sarah ran blank the yard, and they have to construct meaning of that sentence in order to choose the correct answer of across. For numbers and operations, a first grader might get a question like, find the 4th house from the tree. And in this context, a student has to use their numeric knowledge in a literary context. For vocabulary, a first grader might get a question like, Jada will feed her pets every day. She will give them food that is good for them. What does feed mean? And the student can use their background knowledge as well as the definition in one of those sentences and the context clue around the underlined word feed to select the right answer. For analyzing literary text, a first grader might get a question like, Hannah lived in a blue town. Everything was blue, the food was blue, the grass was blue, everything was blue, but one thing, Hannah was not blue. What kind of story is this? So students have to analyze the different aspects of that text in order to determine whether it's a story about a real person, a story about like real life, or a make-believe story. And for understanding author's craft, a first grader might get a question like, I like my yellow coat. I put it on when it is raining. It makes a funny noise when I walk. Which word tells what the coat looks like? And for the different answers that are there, raining, yellow, and noise, all of those answers are in the different sentences in the original text. So the student has to really hone in on the word look in order to answer the question correctly. So those are examples of the different types of questions students might see. The way that our computer adaptive tests work is that students are tested in the different sort of skill strands that we see here. And as students are answering questions correctly, they'll move on to the different skill strands. And eventually, the STAR cats provide us with one overall score that covers student performance across STAR early literacy or STAR reading. So they end up with one score, even though they're tested in all these different skill areas. So let's see how our students performed last year.
Hey, Molly. There's a couple folks in the chat who are wondering, those are students themselves like reading the questions that you Joe just answered. So it sounds like the questions are read to the students. Is that right?
Yeah, it depends on the test. I'm going to go back to one of the examples that I have here. If you can, it might be a little blurry for you, but there's the option to click on this little listen button, and then the audio plays for the student. So they're listening to the question. That's a really good question. So let's look at performance on our STAR early literacy and STAR reading cats. So here what we are looking at is overall performance for students in grades K-3 on STAR early literacy and STAR reading. We have three different columns here. We have performance on fall all the way to the left, winter in the middle, and spring to the right. What we are focusing on is the percentage of students who performed at or above benchmark, which is the dark blue boxes at the top of the bars. Below that, we have the percentage of students who performed on watch in light blue. In light gray, we have the percentage of students who performed in strategic intervention. In dark gray, we have the percentage of students who performed in intensive intervention. And at the very bottom in the black bars, we have the percentage of students who were not tested in each of those seasons. So what happened last year was in the fall, 23% of our kindergartners through third graders performed at or above benchmark or on grade level back in fall. And in spring, 38% of our K through third graders performed at or above benchmark or at or above grade level. This was an increase of about 5,000 students or 15% of our K through 3 students scoring at or above benchmark from fall to spring 21-22. So this is overall across all of our students. And on the next slide, we're going to look at the same data by grade level. So this graph is much more complex, but it's the exact same data we saw on the previous slide. And the graph here is broken up into 4 groups for the different grade levels. So all the way to the left, we have kindergartners, then first graders, second graders, and to the right, we have third graders. So starting with our kindergartners, we see that 26% of our incoming kindergartners performed at or above benchmark or on grade level last fall. And in spring, 48% scored at or above benchmark. This is an increase of 22% of our kindergartners, or about 2,000 of them, performing at or above benchmark from spring to fall. For first and second graders, our 24% of our first graders performed at or above benchmark in fall of last year, and 20% of our second graders performed at or above benchmark in fall. In spring, both groups had an increase. Our first graders had an increase of, sorry, things are covered up on my screen, of about 15% from fall to spring, ending the year, and 39% of our first graders performing at or above benchmark in spring. And for our second graders, there was an increase of 12 percentage points from fall to spring, with second graders ending the year with 32% of them performing at or above benchmark in spring. For third graders, 24% of our third graders performed at or above benchmark in fall, and this increased to 31% by spring, so an increase of about 7 percentage points from fall to spring for our third graders. So overall, that is how our K through 3 students performed on the STAR Early Literacy and STAR Reading computer adaptive tests last year. Now I want to talk a bit about our CBMs. So as I mentioned, our CBMs are individual 60-second probes that get into specific skill strands. And here are the different CBMs that our students take. I'll give examples of what each of these look like. They focus on letter naming, letter sounds, phoneme segmentation, receptive nonsense words, expressive nonsense words, and passage oral reading. So as I mentioned, different grade levels will get different CBMs. So just keep that in mind as we look at these. For letter naming, our kindergartners will see a list of words like this, or a list of letters, I'm sorry. A teacher will say a letter and the students need to find that letter. For letter sounds, students will see a list of letters like this as well, and students will be asked to read or pronounce the different letters. For phoneme segmentation, students will see a series of simple, potentially familiar phonemes and be asked to pronounce as many as they can. For receptive nonsense words, students will see a long list of nonsense words that's a lot longer than this. Teachers will read a nonsense word and students will be asked to find that word. For expressive nonsense words, students will see a very long list of nonsense words again and be asked to pronounce those nonsense words. For passage oral reading, students will see a passage that is about 3 paragraphs of this length, roughly, and students will be asked to read that section. So there's just some examples of what the CBMs look like. Now I want to go over some of the results for our K-3 STAR reading CBM performance from last year. So here we are looking at just kindergartner performance on 3 CBMs: letter naming, letter sounds, and receptive nonsense words. This figure is set up exactly like the figures we saw before. The graph has 3 different sections, one for each of our CBMs that I'll be talking about, as well as a column for the 3 different seasons: fall, winter, and spring. Starting with letter naming and letter sounds, our kindergartners saw a 21 percentage point increase in the percent of students performing at or above benchmark or on grade level on letter naming and receptive nonsense words from fall to spring. So for letter naming, this was an increase from 27% in fall to 48% in spring. And for receptive nonsense words, this was an increase from 15% in fall to 37% in spring. For letter sounds, our kindergartners saw a 27% increase in the percentage of students performing at or above benchmark from fall to spring. This was an increase of 16% from fall to 43% in spring. So now we are looking at the remaining 3 CBMs: phoneme segmentation, expressive nonsense words, and passage oral reading. The figures that we're looking at here combines multiple grades together, but I'll go over these as we talk about them. So starting with just phoneme segmentation, this combines performance from our kindergartners and our first graders. Our kindergartners and first graders combined saw an increase of 37 percentage points in the percent of students performing at or above benchmark or on grade level on phoneme segmentation from fall to spring. This was an increase from about 7% of the population in fall to 44% in spring. For expressive nonsense words, this combines performance from our first and second graders. Our first and second graders had an increase of 17 percentage points and the percentage of students performing at or above benchmark on expressive nonsense words from fall to spring, an increase from 21% in fall to 38% in spring. For passage oral reading, this combines the performance of first, second, and third graders. This group of students saw a 15% increase in the percent of students performing at or above benchmark on passage oral reading from fall to spring. This started at 25% of our students performing at or above benchmark in fall to 40% in spring. So overall, that is how our students were performing on our STAR CATs and CBMs last year. Now I want to talk a bit about where to find district early literacy data. I mentioned a few links earlier, and I'll go into a bit more detail now. So one of the ways to find district early literacy data is through our dashboards, dashboards.philasd.org, and then there's a whole bunch of extra text depending on the sort of topic you're looking for. Our dashboards have information about our district goals and guardrails, which guide a lot of the work that we do district-wide. as well as have data on PSSA performance over the years, as well as STAR reading performance, like the data that I was presenting today. Our district open data website, which you can follow this long link here, or what I do daily is open up Google and type School District of Philadelphia and open data, and it brings me right to this website right here. Our open data website is a great resource for lots of different types of data about the school district. And today I'm going to be honing in on literacy and assessment data, but there's data on all different types of things on this website. So if you were to go to this website and click on school performance, you'll see a whole bunch of data sets on how schools are doing, as well as PSSA data that is available. Another resource is the ORE reports, briefs, and slide decks. So if you visit ORE's website, philsd.org/research, in our quick links tab right over here, the first link is reports and briefs. And on our reports and briefs page, we have all of our reports and briefs that show up, and they're also tagged into different categories. So for example, when I clicked on the literacy category, a whole bunch of reports and briefs on literacy popped up, including the report that I presented data on today, the STAR Reading CBM participation and performance. So overall, those are where to find some data on our district performance. And now I think we are ready to open it up to questions.
Thank you, Molly. We do have quite a few questions in the chat, some of which Joe has done a great job of answering as we've gone, but I think that there probably are some that are worth discussing a little bit more. One question I think that just like to help our audience and myself understand kind of some of the data that you just shared, Nancy asked, if you could expand on like why the 40th percentile is deemed to be the benchmark. It was a question I had as well when you were speaking. So like when we talk about like grade level reading in the context of these data, it sounds like what you're saying is like it's a benchmark against a national standard. Am I playing that back accurately?
Yes, it is a benchmark against a national standard, but one of the things we did look at before we selected the 40th percentile for reading as our benchmark is we tried to align it to PSSA performance. And what we found is, I can't remember the exact percentage, maybe 75% roughly historically of our students who performed proficient or advanced on the PSSAs were also performing at the 40th percentile or higher on STAR early literacy and STAR reading. I believe that is how we were choosing that 40th percentile. It's also semi-recommended by STAR, but we wanted to back that up with our PSSA performance data.
So that allows the district to compare scores on the PSSAs to scores on the STAR assessments?
It does allow us to make some comparisons to look and see what that relationship is between STAR performance for our third through eighth graders and their PSSA performance. And historically, sort of pre-COVID a little bit, we were seeing this pretty strong correlation between students who performed in the 40th percentile or better on STAR reading and early literacy and performing proficient or advanced on the reading or the ELA PSSAs. And we're still looking into this a bit for last year's data.
I see some other questions in the chat. Would also just like to invite anyone who would like to unmute themselves if you want to ask a question to the entire group. Jenny, I see a couple of questions from you. Did you want to unmute yourself and pose it directly to Molly?
Sure. I mean, Joseph answered my first one. I was really interested in kind of trend data, longitudinal data, not about any individual students or individual schools, but what the district is seeing in terms of student progress over time. And given that the STAR assessment, this is only the second year that you're using it in K-5, I'm wondering what data the district is looking at to kind of compare reading skills pre-pandemic to now, if any, or how they're tackling that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So last year, we did do a comparison between performance on Ames web assessments, which is what our district students were taking up until we switched over to STAR, to STAR performance. It's not a perfect one-to-one. The assessments are different in terms of how they're structured, in terms of how the scores are calculated, but we were able to at least make some general comparisons because we cover the same topics. So that is something we were doing last year. We are also continuing to make comparisons using PSSA scores, although of course they only start in 3rd grade and up. I don't know if anyone else has any other answers they would like to add on to that.
And is there a place where people can easily find that year-over-year data when the assessments are different like that? An outsider like ourselves, if we want, because like the dashboards, they would go into they would have the Ames web and the STAR, but could someone like myself make sense of what those mean to compare them, or do we need to talk to you about that?
That's a good question. The dashboards do have the comparisons, and I think in terms of sort of a general how were students doing on these 2 assessments, it's very clear comparisons there. It's easy to interpret. There are definitely caveats to making comparisons between those 2 assessments, and I have those caveats in a report that we published last spring, I believe, on our sort of fall to fall literacy performance overall. So those have sort of paragraphs of caveats, but overall, in terms of just generally how are students doing, how are they doing a couple of years ago versus now, I think it's generally appropriate to look at that data that's on our dashboards.
Great. And if you don't mind, I have one more question, which I'm just curious if you can articulate for us why the district likes STAR and why the change was made, since longitudinal data can be so important. I'm sure it's great. I'm not questioning that. I just kind of want to understand the thinking a little.
Absolutely. I might pass this over to my colleagues because I wasn't in the room when we made that decision.
Sure. Yeah, this is a good question. And actually the shift caused a lot of concern, I think, from some of our teachers. One of the main reasons we wanted to shift to STAR was STAR is a true universal screening tool. Previous to using STAR, as you know, we used Ames web, and we also had benchmark assessments that were in our platform called SchoolNet. And previously, the Ames or the benchmarks, the quarterly benchmarks, were tied specifically to our district scope and sequence. So students were only tested on content that they had just been taught. All students received the same exact questions. And what we were, and they were aligned to the grade level standards. What we found was a lot of our schools were saying, like, you know, unfortunately, we do have a significant number of students who are below grade level. And so our school-based folks felt like, you know, our students are taking these quarterly benchmarks. The only finding we're really getting is whether or not our students have mastered the grade level content, but we know a lot of our kids are below grade level. These benchmarks aren't telling us where those students are at. These benchmarks aren't telling us what skills they need to work on to be able to progress and move forward to master grade level content. So that's kind of why we made the shift, is because we felt like we needed a tool that was a little bit more sensitive and could really tell our teachers, here's where all of your kids are at individually in terms of their current learning progression.
And if I may add to that, STAR is able to provide us with a larger range of information. Ames web, as you know, is primarily an early literacy and numeracy assessment. It is most meaningful for K-3, and we have started using it K-5 in its later years, but that's pretty much it. With STAR, you have assessments that range from K-12 for both reading and math. And for the computer adaptive tests, the beauty of STAR is you have a universal scale, so you can track a student from the earlier parts of the scale all the way to 12th grade when they're at the higher levels of the scale. And the scaled scores are comparable across grades and across years. So that is something that we are really taking advantage of in our analyses right now. And in addition to that, kind of completing what Joe was saying about the benchmarks and STAR replacing them. STAR is a screening tool, a diagnostic tool, and also an instructional tool. For example, we use STAR to understand where the students are at for 3 of our windows throughout the year this year. And when we designate a student based on their national percentile ranking as an intervention student, intensive or strategic, then we do progress monitoring, again, using STAR's progress monitoring tool to test them more often between the windows to see what progress they are making with the interventions. So STAR is giving us more tools to track students throughout the year and more grade levels to track them throughout their educational career with us. And if I may also add, because I was doing some cohort studies based on this earlier, understanding what happened during COVID, the quote unquote, the learning loss and all of those things that everybody is interested in, including us. It was very unfortunate that we did this transition during that COVID period, but this was something that was planned. It wasn't like haphazard. We already had these plans to do a transition to a universal screener, and COVID hit at that time. So we also are facing the difficulty of understanding what happened. And as you know, our goals and guardrails are looking at also the student growth and things like that. And we also had some difficulty in making sure we're understanding our progress towards those targets. But we had to make that change at some point. I think in the long run, this is going to be a good investment in understanding where we are and where we are going.
I see a question in the chat from Nancy. Will you comment on how teachers are supported to use this data to inform instruction?
Sure. Yeah, that's my office. So we have a team of data specialists who are assigned to each network of schools. And so throughout the year, we're kind of providing regular data support. And so we tend to do trainings at the start of the year to make sure that people, you know, are comfortable with utilizing the platform, administering the assessment, and then, you know, learning about the key metrics in the reports section of the platform and how to access the reports. And then actually coming up on December 16th, we're going to do what's called our Star 102 session. So what I just described that we do at the start of the year is like our 101. Our 102 is really around how to make the data more actionable. And so some things that we're going to go over, there's a grouping function in the STAR platform. So we're going to show teachers how they can create their groups and kind of give them some tips around, you know, what makes sense when you're thinking about grouping students so that, you know, kids are, you know, focusing on the same skills. They're being placed in groups where they're working on the same things. We're going to show teachers, once you've created groups, you can actually access reports specific for that group of students. So you can see data that's a little bit more narrowed down in terms of trends across students. And then there's a neat little feature in the platform as well that allows you to assign what are called skill checks for students. So this is something that we don't require teachers to do, but the nice thing about skill checks, they're kind of mini formative assessments. They're 5 questions, multiple choice. They're pre-created in the platform. So teachers don't have to make anything themselves. They're scored in the platform. And so whereas the assessments cover the standard assessments that students are taking cover content taught across the entirety of the curriculum, With the skill checks, you could focus on just one standard or one skill that you're teaching at the moment. So that's just a kind of a little bit of a detailed way of how we're currently working with teachers to use this data to inform instruction. One thing I will note real quick too, sorry, because this does come up, STAR itself is not an intervention. Now, Renaissance is the company that owns STAR. They do have adaptive programs that could be used for the purposes of interventions, but we do not, they're not currently part of what our district is purchasing. None of our schools have that. We strictly have it, the assessment side of the Renaissance platform. So I just want to know that. So we can monitor student progress, but that instructional piece is not provided through the STAR platform.
There was a question in the chat about what parents are shared with according to STAR results. As a district parent myself, so I can answer this question based on my parent experience. Parents who have access to the parent portal, who have signed up for the parent portal, are able to go in a specific module to see all of the scores that their students are getting, including their PSSA scores and each Windows STAR results. Unfortunately, that module is not very straightforward. They have to kind of look for it to know that these scores are there. So that is something that we are working on to make it more available, that information to be more widespread among parents. But the other thing that parents can do, which I do, is on Renaissance website, they can sign up for report cards to be emailed to them. So you enter your email, or you can enter also another email, like another parent or guardian. And each time a student takes a test, and it could be any of the tests, including progress monitoring, STAR sends you a one-pager with where the student is and different domain scores that they receive, and kind of giving them developing skills or at grade level skills. So those kinds of where they are, the parents are able to see in those one-pagers. But that's pretty much it. And of course, they can always talk to the teachers about where their students are. I mean, as a parent, I do receive communications from our teachers about where the dates of the windows that the testing is happening. And also during report card conferences, they talk about their STAR results and where the student is standing in terms of their STAR performance.
Yeah, and we do have a flyer that provides a bit of a stepper in terms of how you can sign up for Home Connect. And truthfully, this is an area we're trying to significantly make improvements in. Like Bruce said, some of what's available, frankly, isn't good enough. So we have developed some new materials. The other challenge, though, is kind of disseminating that information to parents. So this is kind of a constant battle that we're currently engaged in, and hopefully we'll come up with some creative ways to really engage parents around this. But I'll try to share the flyer with you.
What are the barriers to that? Can you talk a little bit more about like why that's not just a matter of course?
Yeah, sure. So at a district level, something I can give you details on. We do parent workshops through our Family and Community Engagement Office. So I ran those workshops for STAR last year, and I think we had like 4 or 5 parents show up. This fall, we had an event in person at 440. Also, a parent event ran through our FACE office, and I had another 4 or 5 parents come to that. So just low turnout. I don't know if, because I'm not part of the FACE office, what their communication techniques are. I suspect maybe they could be, maybe beefed up a little bit or tweaked. But that's from a district standpoint. We then try to We have at each school what are called Star Champions. Most of our Star Champions are our school-based teacher leaders. That's not always the case, but they're the people who are our main points of contact. So we have tried to train them on parent engagement around Star, the different materials that are available. But I think sometimes the train the trainer model can just be really difficult. So we're able to get in front of them for 60 minutes and kind of go over this with them. And then they have to disseminate the information to their teachers who, have all kinds of other things they're worried about in addition to trying to get parents signed up for this thing. So I think, unfortunately, it's how can we get that direct contact with parents, and we've struggled with that.
Jumping around a little bit, Sarah Morningstar had a question a few minutes ago about the students that make up that 7 to 11% of the untested cohort. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and maybe what are the reasons why there are groups of students who are untested?
Yeah, there's different reasons. The biggest reason is that population also includes students who have an IEP and don't necessarily have to take our STAR test. They're not required to, given whatever disability they might have. But because of our sort of record keeping techniques at this point, they're still included in that population, even though we would love to exclude them from that population, so it doesn't look like we have low groups of test takers. The other reason is that if students just don't show up to school during the testing window, it's really hard to do a makeup or have them test later. And for certain grades, high school in particular, if students need to take, for instance, the Keystone exams, which are now graduation requirements, if they haven't taken STAR and they haven't taken the Keystone, they're going to be pulled in to take the Keystone assessment because that's required for graduation, and schools aren't going to be worried about STAR at that point. So that's generally the two primary reasons. I'm not sure if, Joe, you might have another reason, but that's generally what we think of when we're talking about that population.
No, I think you covered it. Yeah.
This is all very fascinating and complex. Sorry, just seeing a couple of the questions in the chat. Oh yeah, so Sarah, you're asking, do students with IEPs take PSSAs?
I can answer that question. So some students that have IEPs do take the regular PSSA. Most of them do take the PASA, which is the alternative version of the PSSAs for students with certain disabilities, and some are exempt. So it depends on what the actual IEP says and what the designation is.
Other questions? Just looking in the chat. What kinds of social emotional support is given to students who might feel anxious about these assessments? Can you all speak to that? Might be more of a instructor question.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're doing a lot of SEL work in schools, but there's nothing that is directly being recommended from kind of the assessment side of things. So it would more be teachers taking what they know from the SEL training they're receiving. The only thing I would say is, and I'm not saying that this necessarily would help a child, but two things I guess I would mention. Number one, the STAR scores are not part of a student's grade. They're not included on their report card. So they are low stakes in that regard. They're not part of state accountability. The other thing, students can retake the test. So we've made that very clear to our STAR champions that if a score is not representative of a student's ability level, feel free to retest them. When we pull the data, we just take the highest score. Again, I don't know that would do much to help a student who has anxiety, but we do make sure folks are aware they can have multiple cracks at it if needed. And yeah, that's for all grades.
Yeah, and another thing that I can add from my parent perspective is confirming what Joe said about the STAR test being lower stakes compared to their grades or PSSAs. For example, during the PSSA period, there is this whole situation at the school. Everybody has to stay silent, and there are the test days that are designated test days. With STAR, it's not like that. And with the online experience that they have had during COVID and afterwards, and also in addition to the online adaptive programs that they are using, like iReady, Lexia, this is another thing that they do online for them. At least that's how our experience is. And I don't think there is a lot of stress associated, especially knowing that they can take it again.
We have just a few more minutes. Would like to continue inviting anyone who would like to ask any other questions that you might have here as we wrap up the hour.
I see Sarah put a question in the chat box about how teachers are using these assessment results. I think it's a mixed bag. Like I had mentioned in response to the one question, for our 6 to 12 teachers, this is year 3 using STAR. For K to 5, this is year 2. I think that when it really comes to using like skill level data to inform instruction, our K to 5 teachers lean way more heavily on the CBMs. I think that the computer adaptive test data that our K to 5 teachers are getting, they're using to help them kind of track, like Molly talked about before, what percentage of our students need interventions. I think Abreu was talking about that as well. So I think from an instructional standpoint, the CBM data is a lot more useful, and that's what the teachers are really leaning on. From kind of monitoring student progress, student growth, the computer adaptive test is being used pretty consistently in that regard. We do get skill level data for the computer adaptive test. I want to note that, but it's kind of overwhelming, frankly, because there's so many different domains that are taught or that are assessed on the computer adaptive. So I think the CBM data just feels a lot more easily digestible for our K to 5 teachers, and that's probably in part why they tend to use that more when thinking about informing their instruction.
Yeah, and I'll just add, of the 6 CAT domains that I presented today, there's between 3 and 8 subdomains for each of them. So teachers are seeing a lot for each every time their students are taking the CATs.
I see another question from Nancy. Is it a challenge for teachers to individually administer the CBMs?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about, for some of our grades, students have to take 4 CBMs in reading and 4 in math, plus they have to take the computer adaptive test. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I think our schools do a great job of trying to navigate that, and they have systems in place to get students assessed. We actually have really good participation rates, which is really a credit to our schools. This is also one of the reasons we have 4 assessment windows. Brew mentioned with only 3 are mandatory. One of the reasons for that was to try to kind of take some of that burden off of schools and reduce, the amount of assessment required.
Also, one thing that is probably contributing to our high participation rate for CBMs and STAR is they are very similar to AIMSweb, and AIMSweb was something that our teachers at the K-5 level were doing for many years beforehand, especially for K-3. So they are having the practice, and each of these CBMs are 1-minute tests, so it's just 60 seconds. So for each student, it probably goes fast. I haven't seen it being administered in person, except during the virtual period where it was 1-to-1 but online. It takes time, but them being just these short assessments is probably a positive thing.
And real quick, we had a question about, are these results used to identify students who need interventions? That's exactly what we're recommending teachers to do. We have pretty well laid out progress monitoring guidance, and essentially the determinations around who should be progress monitored are based on performance on the computer adaptive test. Now, we also tell teachers, use your professional judgment. If you feel like additional students need to be progress monitored, please feel free to go above and beyond. Or in the rare case, if you feel like a score is not representative of a student's performance, you can make that call and not progress monitor them. But yeah, we're asking them to use the STAR data to determine who should be progress monitored. And then the question about kindergartners, the window this fall opened, I think, on September 6th. And schools have pretty much until they had until the end of September just about to complete testing. So I don't believe these results were used during those interviews.
So what happens during the kindergarten interviews is something called the kindergarten entry inventory. So that is the thing that they do during those interviews for the kindergartners. And that is generally, it's not an assessment, it's an inventory. It's to understand the numeracy and letter recognition for the students and a bunch of other things in different domains. So that's what the teachers basically start with. But then soon after, as Joe said, in September, they start the CBMs and other assessments, and that's what they keep going with. Those are the assessments that they use for interventions and other things. And there was a question, which is kind of to complement what Joe was saying about the interventions. We know which students need the interventions through our assessments, how partners can join in this effort. It is basically going to be based on the schools that partner with different organizations. So it is not something that is done from 440. It is basically organizations partnering up with schools, and that's the partnerships work with the school level. Although we have a strategic partnerships office you might be familiar with, and if you work with them, they can be instrumental in directing you to schools that need more help. So they will know, or they will ask us which school has a higher percentage of K-3 students in intervention, and we could definitely help them with that kind of information if needed for partnering schools and organizations.
Well, we are a little past 1 p.m. I want to just get us wrapped up and say thank you to Molly, Joe, and Ebru for walking us through all of this. This is a lot of information. And I think a lot of us are digesting a lot of what we've learned, and trying to think of ways to apply and kind of make some connections. But again, just want to say thank you to the three of you and to our audience today for your thoughtful questions. Like I mentioned earlier in the session, we will be posting the recording of this session on YouTube if you'd like to revisit it. And otherwise, please stay tuned to Read by Fourth newsletters for more information on upcoming sessions.